Hello, I'm making a basic beanie in chunky. It's for a child 4 years and older, but it can fit an adult. And I will be casting on 61 stitches. The pattern calls for 60 and also calls for the work to be 15 centimeters before the decrease. There's a video on how to decrease the crown, as well as a video on how to sew up the seamless. Let me see if I can find it here. This is the inside. As you can see, there's 4 rows, but on the outside, that is the seam, but it's seamless. It's invisible. So there are videos on that in Basic Beanie Chunky. We are going to be casting on 61 stitches. The pattern is over 6 stitches. So if you wish to increase or decrease the size, because if you want to use a thinner yarn and smaller needles, you are decreasing and increasing over the 6 times multiple table, because the pattern is over 6 stitches. You have 3 purls and 3 knits that create your rib. It's a rib of 3 by 3. So you can go up to 60 plus 1, 61 stitches. You can go down to 54 plus 1, which is 55 stitches. And the 1 stitch is used, here's this, to sew up that in an invisible way. So let's get started. Everyone casts on differently. The way I cast on is I use 2 needles and I use a twisting method. I'll show you how to do that. It gives a loose, I cast on under tension, but when the work is finished, this band here created by the cast on is not tight. So it's absolutely excellent for stretches and for the bottoms of jerseys and things like that, where you absolutely want to have enough room to get into the article of clothing. I'm going to use 2.5 arms, simply because I need to have a bit of an extra tail to sew up. The last one I was a little bit short of tail, so I'm going to take 2.5 arms. I pinch, I pull it to my armpit, I bring it back. Pinch, pull it to my armpit, bring it back. Pinch, pull it to my elbow, bring it back, and then I make a loop. Different ways of making loops. I just twist around my finger once, catch it with my other fingers, push it through, and there's my loop. I put them onto my 2 needles. Now the tail I put in front on my chest, and the working yarn, which comes from the balls, is to the back. These are 2 strands of DK with a 7.5 mil. You adjust your needles and your yarn accordingly. But this is a chunky. So I'm going to be casting on 60. I make a duck's bill, stick between my 2 yarns, open my fingers, pinch, move my little finger over, and use my little finger to catch the other one. Now the 2 yarns are lying like that. Duck's bill goes between the 2, and then the duck's bill opens. Close the duck, open the duck. It's lying in the middle. I pull it towards me, and I twist my needles this way, and I scratch up my thumb as an indication. I go and fetch the yarn on the other side, and I bring it back, and I scratch down my thumb. Once the loop is on the needle and you've pulled it through, you drop the yarn on your thumb, but then your thumb immediately goes underneath and you open your duck's mouth. Do that again. Pull the needles forward, scratch up the thumb, go and fetch the yarn on the pointing finger, bring the yarn back, scratch down the thumb, drop the yarn on the thumb, immediately go underneath and pull, because that closes the loop. And now your duck bill's open. And as you do that, you're going to be twisting. When you finish that, you twist your yarn so that now your needles are in the middle again. Look. Scratch up thumb, go to the pointing finger yarn, pull it, bring it, scratch down thumb, drop yarn on thumb, thumb goes underneath and pulls that loop closed. Scratch up thumb, go and fetch the yarn on pointing finger, scratch down thumb, drop yarn on thumb, thumb goes underneath and immediately pulls it. And that is the motion. If you haven't quite got it, go back to the beginning. I'm just going to slowly do this, so that if you do have it and you want to watch the motion, you can. And you pull the needles to the middle and the yarn will feed through there. It's really important that you have the tail yarn in front of you and you have the working balls behind you. Behind is this one here, because that eats up a lot of yarn. If you're using your tail, you will run out of yarn. You won't be able to complete your stitches. This thumb here needs to give it a good tug, so they're sitting all nicely together on the needle. Now, depending on how many stitches you're making, you might at some point need to pull out one of the needles and reposition it. If you're only making, say, 30 or 40 stitches, then you don't have to do that. You can keep on pushing your stitches back on your needle until you've got some more space. But if at some point, especially if you're working with circular needles, you will need to pull out one of the needles. And I will show you how to do that now. You have your 2 needles. Now, if you are circular needles, it's different, but if with these ones, you just have to push one and pull the other. Holding the work here, because you don't want it all to fall off. You basically will maneuver the back, holding until one of your needles comes out. Your stitches are loose. As I said, that's ideal for having a lovely loose cuff. Now, your needle that's free, you need to put it underneath again. Put underneath 3 stitches so that you can continue with your increase of your casting. You can continue with your cast on. And that is how you will pull the needle out and put it back in. For instance, if you're knitting a blanket and you're casting on 150 stitches, then you'll need to do that quite a lot, because there'll be circular needles, and the circular needles, you have to do this more often. Otherwise, if you try and pull your circular needle out using the cable, you will damage your cable. It's a longer method of cast on, takes longer, but it gives lovely results. Be generous with your tail. You can always cut some of it off. Don't cut it too short, because you want to use it, at least some of it, to sew up your garment. Sometimes you might need it to sew up all the way. For instance, if you're making armpits of a little jersey or something, then you will use your tail from your cuff to sew all the way up to the armpit. I'm going to count my stitches now. I've got a generous tail still. Normally my tail indicates when I've come to the end, because if I make many of them, then I calculate my tail to not waste yarn. But let's count. Now the color is a bit tricky, so we have to count carefully. I count in groups of 10, and then I count in my head, and then I say the number out loud. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. I have 57. I need 61. Means I need 4 more. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to count them again simply because it's a shame to start the work and realize that you've miscounted. If you've miscounted by 1, it's not serious. You can pick it up. I mean, you can create a stitch. But if you've miscounted by 5 or 6, it's a disaster. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 61. Turn the work. The first, because of the way that I cast on, I have this bumpy side on this side, and I have this lovely smooth edge on that side. I want the smooth edge to be the outside of my work. And because the two sides of my work, I need to have knits and knits. What do I need to do? I need to start with purls. I'm going to purl 3, knit 3 all the way to the end, and then the last stitch will be a purl 1. So I'm purling 3 because this is the wrong side of the work. And then I'm knitting 3. Now the stitches are loose, but my first row is under tension. This yarn here is tight. And you can't go wrong with your stitch count here because it's almost impossible to undo a stitch and come back. It's very hard. And then you'll have to start all over again with your cast on. So I'm going to count and not talk. 3. Last stitch, purl 1. So if I've come to the end of the row and my count is correct, then I know I haven't made a mistake somewhere. It still looks loose and messy, but as the work progresses, it falls into place. Now we're doing row 2, And this is the right side of the work. So the first stitch is going to present itself as a knit. That'll be my edge, which I'll use for sewing up. The next 3 stitches present as purls, the next 3 present as knit, and that is creating the 3-3 rib. The 3-3 rib has a looser fit on the head than a 2x2 rib. And the 2x2 rib has a looser fit on the head than the 1-1 rib. A 3-3 rib is, it kind of sits on the head rather than grips the head. The 1-1 rib grips. That's why it's great for cuffs, around the neck, because it really does pull in. But if it's not the right size for a hat, the 1-1 rib can be a little bit tight on the head. So you need to be very generous with how many stitches you make, so that it isn't gripping the head, because otherwise the person's going to want to take it off after a while. Whereas the 3-3 rib, when the size is right, it will just plonk on their head, and it'll be very comfortable. So the yarn will have a difference as to how the yarn has a difference, will create an easier bounce, I mean more of a bounce or less of a bounce, if that makes any sense. So if you're using a yarn that does not have a lot of bounce in it, then the circumference of the head is important in relation to the finished product. This yarn has a good bounce to it, a good stretch. You'll just continue the rows, and you will purl or knit the stitch as they present themselves to you. And this pattern requires 15 centimeter work before the decrease. For an adult, my beanie lengths, I work on average of 18.5 centimeters for the finished product. That's for an adult woman or a man with a small head like a woman. If it's an adult man with a large head, then you're going to go up to at least 22 centimeters. This is for a child, but as I said, they're quite happy to wear the hat. Whoops. See there, now if I'd done that when the cast on, it would have unraveled everything. But luckily I'm a couple rows in, so I could save that stitch and pick it up. I will in this playlist have a little show and tell of different beanies with different yarns, different stitch counts, but just to show you that the basic beanie can either be worked in chunky. I've also have a playlist for the basic beanie in double knit, and there it has 97 stitches, and it has a 5mm needle. So if you go and look at that playlist, you can see that. Now, just to show you a different yarn, this is a 3x3, and this yarn is called Chinel or something, I can't pronounce it. It has no bounce at all. So I made a whole lot of them, but to fit an adult woman. And it's basically a beanie that just pops on the head, and it folds over just a little bit. So I made it 20 centimeters, and it has a little tiny fold over, which gives it a 1920s look. and with a short cropped hairstyle. It's very, very cute. But because of the yarn, this little fold over stays in place. So I've made a whole bunch of them. All behind me here. It's a different color. This is a slightly different yarn. This is the same chenille. Once again, it'll have a little tiny fold over that surprisingly stays in place because of this yarn. This one looks the same, but it's not, and this one has a bounce. Same pattern, same stitch count. These are knitted in 5mm, and I was working around about 87 stitches because this one does not stretch. So instead of 97, I was working on 87. So you can see the yarn will make a big difference on what your result is. And then you might be horrified because you say, well, my beanie doesn't bounce. Really depends on your yarn. If you compare to this one, which is just 61 stitches, chunky, look how it bounces. The original pattern, I've modified it slightly, but the original pattern for CAS, Knit Square project / charity here in South Africa, they were looking for chunky beanies, 2-ply, 7.5 mil, 60 stitches. And I added one because I use a rim. I make my invisible seam. And she has a slightly different pattern on the decrease, on the crown. I actually prefer the 7 mil, and this is knitted on a 7mm, and I did 67 stitches. So I basically added a cluster or a group, which is 3, 3. So I went from 61 stitches up to 67, and I did it on a 7mm circular needle, which is not in plastic. 7mm metal, which I much prefer to the 7.5 in plastic. So play around and see what is comfortable for you, because once you've got something that you really like, then you can make lots of them. As I said, I prefer the metal needles, but I wanted to try out her pattern with 61 stitches on the Knit Square website. I'll put the link below. And in the playlist, you'll find how to do the decrease on the crown, as well as the sewing up of this basic beanie chunky. Thank you very much for watching, and have a lovely day. Bye now.